Hello and welcome to another episode of Intermediate Macroeconomics. Let's see where we were last time. Now, I had just finished up covering, let's see here. Let me zoom in a little bit. And it's trying to focus some more. Wow, why is it still zooming? That's weird. Maybe I actually hit something over here. All right. Okay, yeah, that's better. All right. We had already gone over these study questions here. You can't see this at the very top, but you don't need to see it. It's from the Steve Keen article on Minsky. We went through all the Steve Keen stuff through here in earlier videos. And then down to Koleski, where I drew out all the equations for you. That took quite a while on 93 and 94, and then I explained some of the other stuff. And I got down to the end here where Cherneva is talking about this employer of last resort or jobs program as a means of more effective deficit spending, right? As you know from I guess exam 2 material? Yeah. The United States cannot possibly go bankrupt in its own currency, and so we can use that to, as we did during World War II, to stimulate and put into motion resources that are otherwise idle. All right, so if the market system cannot consistently generate enough employment for everyone, and if in fact it might get worse and worse over time as we're able to work out things like how to make your order at McDonald's from a little screen in the front, which I really love, by the way. I always use the self-ordering screen. And then what are we going to do? We have the ability to produce Big Macs for everybody, but we don't have a job for everybody. So how are we going to address this? Well, she's saying that, yes, what we try right now, like we did after the financial crisis, is sort of a government stimulus. And what we end up trying to do in those cases is to try to get the private sector to rehire people, all right? We don't have the government hire people. We have the private sector try to figure out, try to stimulate the private sector sufficiently to hire people. So take this as an example. Think about the self-checkout line at Walmart and the people that were laid off to create that, because obviously that was the goal, was to lower their labor costs, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And so when we have unemployment created by Walmart adding a self-checkout line, the way the government usually addresses this in terms of fiscal policy stimuli is to try to stimulate the private sector sufficiently to rehire those people somewhere else. Well, there's absolutely no guarantee that that's going to be successful. And so what they're suggesting here in this employer of last resort thing is that and I'm sorry, I should also add, not only not be successful, but it tends to send deficit money into profits and into the wages of higher income workers. Now, if we want to undertake infrastructure, which would do exactly that, it would tend to go into profits and higher wage workers. If we need to build infrastructure, by golly, we need to build infrastructure, and that's all there is to it. But if our goal is to increase employment, and particularly for those who are the most hurt, then infrastructure is a really inefficient way to do it. It rarely reaches those who really need the help. So what should we do instead? I'm glad I asked that question. Now, what I want to show you next are the characteristics of a jobs program and how it compares to how we currently do fiscal policy. And remember, from the previous video, that the whole goal here for Cherneva in putting all this together was to create a theoretical model that she could then use to look at the actual impact of fiscal policy after the financial crisis. Who really got helped? Obviously, everyone got help to an extent. But the question is, was that money efficiently targeted so that it ended up going more or less directly to those who most needed the help? And her answer was no. So, next study question, number 102. And let me just read the intro here for you. Draw the chart that compares traditional deficit spending, the way we do it now, with an employer of last resort, ELR, or a jobs program is what a job program is another popular name for it, regarding the following: Deliberation, size, flexibility, policy entry point on ZD, unemployment reduction method, primary beneficiary, efficiency, and abuse. I'm going to skip this part right here for a second. And in a regular semester, of course, you would be asked to remember all these things. In this semester, and I'm going to email this around, this little chart right here. Let me zoom back out a little bit so you can have the whole thing all at once. Oops, that's the opposite of out. Okay, let me walk over here to the monitor and have a look at it. Yes, that's everything. Okay. The idea of this chart here is to summarize the main post-Keynesian policy recommendation, and that is to, just as we do currently, to use the government to try to stimulate the macroeconomy when we have less than full employment, because there's no point in asking the private sector to do it. The private sector is doing all it needs to do, all it wants to do, and that's not its fault. It has employed all the people who it found to be profitable. And remember, to the private sector, labor is a cost. Labor is something that a reasonable, rational entrepreneur tries to minimize. They try to minimize the use of labor. Well, that's a problem. All right, so we don't want to force the private sector to rehire these people. That doesn't make sense. But instead, we have the government hire them instead. And there's a whole reading on this, but let me go ahead and talk about this first. All right. Here's the way we do it right now. And this is the study question answer right here. As I say, I will simply email you this so you don't have to write this down, but you want to make sure that you understand it for the exam. All right. There's planning issues, there's execution issues, and there's evaluation issues. And let's take planning issues, traditional, I feel like we're on Jeopardy. Alex, planning issues for 100. Deliberation under a traditional means of addressing unemployment, the way we do it now, deficit spending, trying to stimulate the private sector rather than directly employing the unemployed, versus an employer of last resort. Now, after the financial crisis, they had to, pardon me, above and beyond the automatic stabilizers that you talked about on exam 2, the traditional way we have to do it, like we did with after the financial crisis, was we had to have the president and Congress get together and talk about how are we going to address the problem of all the unemployment after the financial crisis. And they came up with a plan that was around $800 billion. Let me tell you this. They originally wanted like $1.3 trillion to help address the unemployment after the financial crisis. They also then discovered, after everything was already underway, that they had underestimated how bad the recession was. So 1.3 was really less than what they needed. But they adjusted it to $800 billion because they thought there was no way Congress would go for it. Not because it was an economic reason for it, but because it was a political reason for it. So they had to argue, and compromise, and there is a considerable time delay, of course, when you have to deliberate. With an employer of last resort, the idea is the government stands ready continuously to hire anyone who can't find a job in the private sector, all right? And, there are various ways you can set this up. Maybe you can be on unemployment for a month, and after that, well, we've got a job for you. And we've got things that need to be done. We've got things that aren't profitable but are of great social benefit. We've got things that cleaning up the environment. We have a terrible problem with climate change, as I just finished in my last lecture in Contending Perspectives. And addressing climate change is not profitable. Otherwise, we'd already be doing it. So set people who are otherwise unemployed to work doing that. Again, here, let me jump down to it because I'm going to keep referencing it, and I want to show it to you. There's going to be, oh, there it is. After this question that I'm showing you right now, there's a 103, and then there's another piece by Cherneva, Unemployment, the Silent Epidemic, where she talks about the cost of unemployment and the things we could do with a jobs program. Oh, that's from the other class. Let me delete that. Okay, so back to this. So the idea is you set up a system whereby the government stands ready on a continuous basis to hire people. During World War II, this was very simple. We needed lots and lots of people to do something that was not profitable but was socially beneficial, and that was fight them damn Nazis. And during the Cold War, My dad found gainful employment out of West Virginia because we needed people to sign up for the Air Force, which is what he did, and defend London from the Soviet scourge. So what we're talking about instead here is to have people sign up, and there's a wide variety of things that you can do. There's a large literature on this. We can have people care for the elderly, which is going to be an increasing problem. We can have people, maintain it doesn't have to be just sort of simplistic jobs. You could be maintaining the web page at the Smithsonian, all right? This is a government job. And the more experience you get, the more likely you are to find another job. That turned out to be a terrible problem after the financial crisis, is that people who had been employed, then this became a black mark on their resume that they were employed for so long. So it became even more difficult to get more gainful employment. Plus, there are people in the inner city, for example, that are chronically unemployed, that have little chance at a decent education, little chance at a stable home life, and very few economic opportunities around them. Okay, we got some economic opportunities right here. By the way, if this sounds a lot like the New Deal during the Great Depression, that's exactly right. That's exactly what it's talking about. To have people engage in activities that will increase the, increase our quality of life, but wouldn't be profitable. All over Fort Worth, there are places that were built by the Works Progress Association and the Civilian Conservation Corps, building parks, so as I say, we don't have a shortage of jobs. One of the things that I thought about, there was a tornado in Oklahoma several years ago that killed a bunch of kids at a grade school. Wouldn't it be nice to have a tornado shelter behind every grade school in Oklahoma? There's no profit in that, but my gosh, you could have people digging a hole and putting in whatever the equipment is to, put in the tornado shelter. And this would perform a social service, and the private sector wouldn't have done it. So when we run out of social problems, then it will be a problem. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but Melanie is now in the shower, and the shower is just behind this wall right here, so I hope that's not too distracting. All right, so we don't have to deliberate. The system is already set up. When we had all the unemployment after the financial crisis, there would have immediately been an opportunity for people who didn't find a job to go to the government and work for them. You're not just getting welfare, you're not just getting unemployment insurance, you're also getting experience and contributing to your community. Different than a universal basic income, by the way, because universal basic income does not address the problem of the social problems that we have around us that are not otherwise being addressed. And I can't overemphasize the climate change stuff, which is a really huge issue. Now, not only do they have to deliberate, and it's going to take some time to figure out what to do traditionally, versus, hey, it's already set up. There's already a place where you go, in your local community, and you find a job and you go take that job, or you can take nothing. And by the way, I'm sorry, let me mention this too. The definition of a job can be rather wide if that's what society wants. It can be, my job is, I want to stay home with my kids. They're, under a certain age, I want to stay home with my kids. I don't want to work a 40-hour-a-week job in order to afford to pay for childcare. All right, there's no point in that. That should not be something we require. These things. Here's another example. During the Great Depression, the New Deal paid historians to go around the U.S. and interview people to create this sort of historic record of American life. For example, they interviewed ex-slaves. Now, the people in the 1930s who were ex-slaves would have been kids when slavery ended. But no one had seen fit before this to bother to interview these people. My gosh, this would have been forever lost. I have a copy of the book, actually. It's like When We Were Young or something like that. I bought it at Appomattox at the Civil War Memorial. And so, again, another idea I had. That you wander around a cemetery, like there's a cool cemetery in Austin that has, supposedly the oldest cemetery in Austin, so a lot of famous people buried there. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a little thing you could scan on each gravestone that tells you something about that person? All right, things that may create a sort of even patriotic sense among Americans, but the private sector is not going to do it. Not unless somebody's going to, pay you to do all that. So anyway, all these jobs are already available. There's no deliberation. Now, as I already told you, size. They had to argue about how big are we going to make it. Now, we already get the automatic stabilizers. Those already helped. But the additional bump was argued about and in fact ended up being less than what they needed because they misjudged how bad it was. That's not a problem here. The size of the program is automatically as big as it needs to be. Oh my gosh, there's more unemployed people than we expected. Well, that's okay. Then there's going to be more jobs created on the public sector than we expected. We don't have to sit and meet and talk about it again. Now, clearly at some point we needed to meet and talk about it. And clearly at some point we had to decide what the wage was going to be. And of course that wage isn't going to be the same in San Francisco as it's going to be in Waxahachie because it's going to be a higher cost of living. But we already calculate these things, all right? It's not going to be impossible to do this. Flexibility. Every time there's a new problem, say like right now with the coronavirus, and we've got all these people thrown out of work, they've got to deliberate all over again. And what's happening right now? This is March 24th. What is happening right now is that they can't agree on how they're going to try to address this problem. Spending automatically adjusts with the jobs program. Spending automatically adjusts. We all of a sudden have a bunch of people put out of work because restaurants have to close. There's another job for you. All right. You're going to be the ones making sure you're going to be working, making more surgical masks or whatever that the society needs right now. All right. Okay, so that's under planning. So the idea is that the job program is superior to the traditional manner of deficit spending, of fiscal stimulus, because of the fact that it's automatic, really is probably the biggest thing out of these over here. By the way, if I were to ask this on the exam, what I generally do is only ask one of these sets. Give me the planning one, or give me the execution one, or give me the evaluation one. But since it's going to be copy and paste because we won't see each other again, then that's not going to be too big a deal for you. All right, next part. Where does it show up? Check this out. I want to draw this on the graph. And let's see if I can put on some lights here to make it easier but not create a glare. Okay, yeah, all right. All right. I want to show you the difference between, hello John, show you the difference between the way we do it now. Let's do it on the same graph. The way we do it now versus the traditional method versus the employer of last resort or the job program. All right, remember from exam 1. Here is nominal GDP employment. And let's say we have a Z-curve there. Remember that the Z-curve shows how many workers firms would like to hire at each level of nominal sales. And let's say that full employment happens to be right there. That's the level at which everyone who wants a job would have a job. Well, let's further say that the current demand curve is intersecting the Z-curve before it gets to NF. All right, so we're at less than full employment. I'm not going to bother to drop the, I guess I'll bother to drop it down. All right, so. All right, so we have unemployment of NF minus N0. The way we address it now is we try to shift the demand curve up. And we hope we hit it. Oops, I meant to make that parallel, sorry. Traditional, all right? So we try to hit that point right there so that essentially what we're doing is we're stimulating the private sector and trying to get the employment to go up to that level up there. That's not the way this would work, because here's the problem. It's really hard to calculate that difference. We know the problem. The problem is whatever this number is, all right? Let's say it's 15 million. I think that's right around where unemployment maxed during the financial or after the financial crisis. Let's say that's 15 million. We know that number. We don't really know how big this needs to be. Here, let's label these things too. There's investment. And there's government spending. All right. We don't really know how big G has to be to intersect NF, as I described a minute ago in how they tried to recover from the financial crisis, right? They not only underestimated, but they also then made political compromises that meant that the stimulus wasn't as big as it needed to be. Remember, I said, there's a car outside driving really fast. Remember I said that this number here, right here, we know it? Let me write that down here. Say 15 million. Well, if we have a job program, then what we do is we create 15 million jobs. It's really quite simple. We take this gap right here, and then this one, we shift the Z curve to the right rather than screwing with the demand curve. And by how much? We know how much to shift that. In fact, we don't even have to count it. They show up at the employment office to get jobs. These people right here will show up to get these public sector jobs, these ELR jobs, all right? So that's going to happen automatically. So let me go back to this. Let's see, anything else about that? Nah, I think that's good. So let's go back to this. Hey, Mel. Oh, here's the dog. All right. So, sorry, Melanie was on the phone, and you were listening in on her phone call to Subaru, where we're trying to pick up our car. Doggy, are you tangled up in the wires? All right. So, let's see here. Let me go back to this screen, and let me zoom this back up a bit so you can see the whole thing again. There. All right. So, we're down to execution. And the first question is, where does it show up, or the first idea here is, on these cells, where does it show up on the ZD diagram? This one was an upward shift in the demand curve, which is really kind of hard to hit, all right? We don't really know how far up to shift G. We're guessing. It's an educated guess, but we're still guessing. Whereas over here, we know exactly how far to shift the Z curve to the right. In fact, you don't even have to figure it out. People just show up and say, I'm out of work. I haven't been able to find a job for a month. And we say, okay, these are the jobs that are available. By the way, one of the concepts with this, and this comes up in one of the study questions, is that you want to keep the wage rates in the public sector that are the jobs being created by this somewhat lower than those in the private sector, so that when the private sector does expand again, people will want to leave and go to the private sector, so that this ends up supplementing the private sector and not replacing the private sector. But anyway, let's see. Going back to, okay, now how does it go about reducing unemployment? The traditional method, indirectly, as I have told you, via stimulation of the private sector. We're hoping by stimulating the private sector that this induces firms to rehire the unemployed people, to rehire the 15 million that were unemployed, right? Meanwhile, this is directly by employing the unemployed. And as I'm going to show you here in the next video, the primary beneficiary over here with the traditional method tends to be going to profits and investment sector workers, who tend to be the higher wage workers. Here, buddy. He wants some attention. So, can he have attention from you? Say hello. No, this way, this way. He doesn't know which way to look. He's a bit camera shy. All right. So the profits, the money tends to go in, which is exactly what Chernova set out to discover with that initial paper we talked about, is where was the money going? She said, well, it's going into profits and investment sector workers. That's not terrible. and it does eventually spill over to the unemployed, but not very efficiently, so we don't end up getting much bang for our buck. Whereas this, who's the primary beneficiary? The unemployed, directly, and low-skilled workers who have a very difficult time getting reemployed. All right, last part, efficiency. Most of the money helps those who didn't need help, which of course is implied by the previous cell right here under the traditional method. And then under the employer of last resort, all of the money, maybe not all of it, but most of the money is going to go directly to solving the problem. Now, can you abuse these systems? Of course you can, but the theory is that it's harder to abuse. Sorry, doggy wants out. Go on. It's harder to abuse the jobs program thing, theoretically, because with the traditional one, what we did after the financial crisis was we said, okay, it's going to be $800 billion, and then everybody starts fighting for a chunk of the $800 billion. Oh, my state needs that. Oh, my state needs that. Hey, how about if I do so-and-so for you, you give me more of that money? So it becomes this big political fight over who gets to have the biggest chunk of the money. Over here, your state gets what your state gets because that's how many unemployed people there are. Period. All right. Obviously, there can be some games played in terms of counting unemployed and stuff like this, but this already determines the allocation from state to state by the fact that your state has more unemployed people, your state gets more money. It's formulaic, and so the hope is that it is more difficult to abuse. All right. So let's see. That finishes that study question off. Before I do the next one, and the next one's going to be, I'm going to do this in another video here in a second. I'm going to show you using the terminology from the Koleskian terminology or variables from Chernoby's paper, sort of a chart on how the traditional versus the employer of last resort works. But before I do that, and the last thing I want to do on this video is remind you, actually I will do this real quick too. On the study question, I decided to include all this information so that I would remember thereafter. In 2010, unemployment was around 9.6%. Okay, so social safety net spending was about $421 billion, while paying every single unemployed person $10 an hour for $40 a week. For 40 hours a week for 50 weeks a year plus 25% for miscellaneous costs would have been $366 billion. Okay, so what that's trying to say is unemployment was 9.6 after we stimulated the economy by 421. If we'd stimulated it by 366 with an employer of last resort, we could have directly employed everyone. We wouldn't have reduced unemployment from 9.6 to 8.9. We would have reduced it from 9.6 to something closer to 0. All right, and when we get around to doing the Excel diagram, which we're still going to do, we'll actually put that into it to show you. But let me stop here and finish off this slide with the following, or this video with the following. I want to remind you of those remember to know goals that I talked about very early on in the semester. These were, what things would I like you to remember about the class? Because I know you're not going to remember the details, because I don't either. And I didn't either from my classes. So if there's like one or two things that you were to remember, what would I hope they would be? And one of them, these are kind of in order. Capitalism is inherently unstable, and it has a tough time getting the full employment. Why? Well, the behavior of physical investment spending contributes to this instability and tendency towards less than full employment. And not only that, but the behavior of the financial sector contributes to this instability and tendency towards less than full employment. And this is where we are now, finally. The government plays a critical role in addressing the instability and tendency towards less than full employment. That's it for now. We're going to go take the dog for a walk.